Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to talk about something that is such a normalized part of most people's everyday lives that they usually don't even notice it. It appears whenever the mind resists what is happening in the present moment, either in physical reality or on the inside. It stems from an unwillingness to experience what is and manifests through, for example, tension, frustration, worry, regret, stress, dissatisfaction, resentment, or a quiet but persistent unease that may very well be present throughout most of our waking hours, and even follow us into bed as we toss and turn while it seems impossible to just close the eyes, lie still, and go to sleep. This state of inner resistance, in turn, causes more resistance as we try to push these uncomfortable feelings away. These unconscious attempts are, of course, futile. And yet, to some degree, it's just how life is. This is an important thing to realize about the human condition, by the way. Namely, that we've been socialized into experiencing life through a very narrow frame compared to what is actually possible. One way that Eckhart Tolle describes inner resistance is as the force that keeps people trapped in patterns of suffering. This resistance is not just a reaction, but an active process that maintains the ego's grip and fuels inner turmoil. Tolle explains that the mind clings to control. It insists that reality should be different from how it is. This inner argument with life creates suffering. Resistance is not caused by external events, but by the mind's refusal to accept them. It's an internal rejection of what already exists. When one resists, tension builds in both mind and body. The resistance does not change the situation, but it makes life feel heavier and more difficult. What we want is to instead allow the experience to be what it is, and therefore let whatever negative emotion we are feeling pass through us instead of holding on to it, feeding it with our thoughts, and creating stories around it, which is what happens when we resist. At the core of resistance is identification with thoughts. As just mentioned, the mind tells stories about what is happening, labeling situations as bad, unfair, or unbearable. When these thoughts are believed, they generate emotional reactions. A long line at the grocery store, a rude comment, an unexpected bill. None of these things have inherent power over our emotions. It is the mental resistance to them that creates discomfort. The moment one believes that something should not be as it is, suffering begins. To understand how this works, you need to have a grasp of the activities of the mind. You probably know that you cannot stop thinking, but you also need to understand some of how this automatic process functions in relation to your emotions. When a negative emotion is triggered, observe how the mind grabs hold of it and how the emotion thereby starts to affect your thoughts. If nothing has triggered the emotion, the mind starts to look for reasons as to why you are feeling the way you do, and it often soon finds something that it can attach to the emotion. Soon, you find yourself in a vicious circle where thoughts and emotions feed each other, and you are usually only vaguely aware that this activity is even going on. And yet, it is causing almost all people some degree of suffering, and in extreme cases, it has ruined people's lives and caused them to commit horrible crimes. All this from an activity that is to a large degree unconscious, even if it gives off the illusion of awareness and free choice. If you can spot this in yourself and keep this realization in the back of your mind, you are already on the road toward becoming free. Tolle describes 2 layers of pain that arise from this resistance, which we touched upon in the beginning, and which we will now explore further. The first is the pain of the present moment, discomfort caused by resisting what is happening right now in the form of a direct experience and the accompanying emotions. The second is accumulated past pain, which Tolle calls the pain body. Tolle teaches that the pain body is like an independent entity that feeds on negative emotional energy, but we will not delve deep into this in this video, since this is a topic for a future video. Here, it's enough to describe the pain body as a collection of old emotional wounds, that have not been released. These unresolved emotions resurface when triggered by present events. When inner resistance strengthens, the pain body is fed, making suffering feel even more intense. Whether you look at the pain body exactly as Tolle describes it or not, the fact that we bottle up emotional energy in our bodies which later gets triggered is very real. So is the fact that this emotional energy is responsible for the frantic, uncontrolled activity that most of us experience both in our inner and external lives. This energy is why the inner shift doesn't happen instantaneously for most of us. We have the ability to let go and surrender to the present moment in an instant. But for most of us, the pull of this energy is so strong that it forces us to go unconscious again. And thus we are yanked out of the brief moment of calm, centered awareness and back into our habit-driven, sleepwalking, erratic ego minds. The ego thrives on inner resistance. It defines itself through struggle, opposition, and comparison. Eckhart Tolle describes the ego as a false sense of self, constructed by the mind through identification with thoughts, emotions, and external things. It is a mental image built from past experiences, future projections, and social conditioning. The ego sees itself as separate and incomplete, constantly seeking validation, security, or superiority. It is sustained by attachment to constructs such as identity, personal history, and roles. Because it is fundamentally unstable, it creates inner conflict and fear to maintain its sense of existence. The ego is not a real entity, but a pattern of thought that creates a false sense of personhood and obscures deeper awareness. Tolle emphasizes that one's true nature exists beyond the ego, as a pure presence, free of mental constructs. When everything is accepted as it is, the ego loses its power. The ego, when we are identified with it, convinces us that life is happening to us rather than through us. When life instead is happening through us, we no longer see ourselves as separate from it. Thus, we align with life's natural flow. In this state, actions arise effortlessly, guided by awareness rather than conditioned reactions. Without identification with thoughts or personal narratives, life unfolds spontaneously, without inner struggle or attachment. Think for a moment about what this means. When you are no longer attached to events in the past or expectations of what is going to happen in the future, or the stories you tell yourself about who you are in relation to all this, you no longer experience yourself as a separate entity, cut off from the whole. This is a very real, tangible shift in awareness and perception, and comes with the feeling of everything fundamentally being okay, despite the storms that may be raging in the external reality. When you are prepared to release the ego's striving for control, a new sense of clarity and ease will arise, which will grow stronger the more you do this. This might be hard to believe if you're caught up in turmoil, and it's important to recognize that some external circumstances are harder to meet with trust and acceptance than others. However, this higher, truer state is very real, and in fact, it is our natural state when we are truly free of all the faulty programming that comes with being human. It can happen instantly, but for most of us, it involves a lot of going back and forth. This is something that could be emphasized more in teachings related to the inner shift. For most people, it doesn't happen in an instant, as it did for example, Eckhart Tolle or Ramana Maharshi. For Maharshi, it happened at a very young age, preceded only by a very brief moment of turmoil. For Tolle, it was preceded by a lot of emotional pain, but he didn't seem aware of the process he was going through until after the shift had occurred. For many of us, though, we can study books on the subject for years and have several glimpses of where all of this is leading, but still be triggered back into the old ego self and all of its identifications over and over again. But if you pay attention, you will also see that, despite things on the surface playing out as they always have, there is also something inside you that has taken a step back from all of it and instead observes it. It can be a very strange experience to watch yourself act in this manner, knowing how unnecessary and counterproductive it is, and yet have no power to stop it. However, as you go through this journey, it will become more and more natural to release your resistance toward whatever is present in the moment. You will notice that you don't get triggered so easily anymore, and more choices about how you respond to situations will present themselves. And in this, you will catch more and more glimpses of this higher state that you are moving toward, which will eventually become your permanent state. The moments of clarity to look for can be, for example, a sense of things falling into place, an inner calm, a sense of lightness, flow, and ease, or the feeling of everything suddenly turning silent. In this, you may experience subtle movements of calm energy inside, or that your awareness is no longer tied to your physical body or brain. Now, the ego does not want peace. It wants drama, problems to solve, and enemies to battle. This is why, even when things are going well, the mind finds something to worry about. A person may feel calm for a moment, but soon a thought appears. What if something goes wrong? What if this happiness does not last? In this way, resistance perpetuates itself. It's good to keep in the back of one's mind that most of the things we worry about never come to pass. But even if we know this intellectually, we tend to forget this as soon as a negative emotion grabs hold of us. And thus, we are again caught up in all kinds of fantasies about things that probably will never come to pass, but which seem more or less as if they are already happening when we picture them in our minds. One of the most deceptive forms of resistance is the belief that it is justified. The mind argues that certain things are too unfair to accept, too painful to allow, or too frustrating to simply let go of and observe. It insists that without resistance, nothing would change. This is an illusion. Accepting the present moment does not mean passive resignation. It does not mean tolerating injustice or giving up on growth. It means facing reality without unnecessary mental struggle. From this place, you can approach your decisions with much more clarity and take appropriate action. This is another one of those things that you may have to turn around in your mind for a while. There is an important yet subtle difference between non-resistance and surrender on the one hand and resignation on the other. A key point here is that Eckhart Tolle, in his works, explains how it is possible to succeed on the material plane while failing on the inner plane, and vice versa. Material success is always transient, and therefore, by its very nature, only important in a relative sense, while surrender to the present moment is the gateway to eternity. Tolle even states that resistance is what paralyzes action. When one fights against life, energy is drained by frustration. When you surrender resistance, action flows naturally. A problem that once felt overwhelming is now handled with clarity. A challenge is met with presence rather than panic. The mind stops creating unnecessary obstacles, and solutions emerge more easily since the answers were already there. They were just clouded by the mind's insistence on trying to control everything with its thoughts. When surrender instead replaces resistance, energy is no longer wasted on inner conflict. This energy can be used for action, creativity, or deep peace. What you will notice in this state is that external reality also tends to respond in a more favorable way. To live from this perspective does require trust in the inherent goodness of being at first, though. If you prefer Christian terminology, you could say that it requires faith. Tolle furthermore emphasizes that resistance often masquerades as constructive thinking. People believe they are solving problems when they are really just repeating mental loops, worrying about the future, replaying past mistakes, or mentally arguing with someone who is not even present. All of this creates inner resistance. The mind keeps busy with these thoughts, convincing itself that it is preparing or protecting. In reality, it is reinforcing suffering. To start breaking free from this, you need to be a bit familiar with your mental activity so that you can spot whether you are really solving an actual problem or just repeating the same patterns over and over again. Emotions are closely tied to resistance. Negative emotions are signals that resistance is present, Anger, resentment, anxiety, these feelings arise when the mind rejects what is. But rather than seeing them as problems, they can be used as guides. When a negative emotion appears, it is an opportunity to notice resistance in action. This awareness alone begins to loosen its grip. The moment one sees that one is resisting, one has a choice. As we have seen, the alternative to resistance is presence. Total presence is surrender. Presence is not a passive state. It is a deep engagement with life as it is. It means fully inhabiting the present moment without mental labels or complaints. When presence is strong, resistance fades. Without resistance, even difficult situations lose their heaviness. A long wait in traffic becomes a moment of stillness. A difficult conversation becomes an opportunity to listen. A mistake becomes a lesson and an invitation to let go of what you cannot control, rather than a source of shame. A powerful way to dissolve resistance is through body awareness. Tolle points out that the body, by itself, never resists the present moment. It exists fully in the now. It is our minds that insist on things not being okay as they are. The tension that arises from resistance can be felt in the body: tight shoulders, a clenched jaw, and a heavy sensation in the chest. Noticing these physical reactions without resisting or holding on to them can be a doorway to presence. By bringing attention to the breath or the feeling of aliveness in the body, resistance begins to weaken. Be careful to notice if your mind has started to struggle with them, though, as it has a tendency to do so. Tolle also highlights the connection between resistance and time. As we have seen, the mind resists the present because it is preoccupied with the past and future. It clings to old stories or worries about what is ahead, but life only ever happens now. When one shifts attention from time to presence, resistance dissolves. The mind may still try to pull away, but awareness can bring it back. In each moment, there is a choice: resist or allow. What we are talking about here is what is called psychological time in Tolle's teachings, which is contrasted with clock time. Clock time is time strictly used for practical purposes, with no stories or emotional baggage attached to it. We have a whole video on this, and there will be a link to it at the end screen. Many forms of suffering are rooted in resistance to impermanence. The mind wants to hold on to a relationship, a role, a sense of identity. It fears change, even though change is inevitable. This fear creates suffering. Instead of flowing with life's natural movement, the mind resists, trying to freeze time. But impermanence is not the problem. Resistance to it is. When one lets go of attachment to fixed identities or situations, a new lightness emerges. Resistance also plays a role in self-judgment. The mind resists itself, criticizing past choices, doubting abilities, or believing it is not enough. This inner conflict fuels insecurity and stress, but self-judgment is just another form of mental resistance. It is the mind turning against itself. The way out is not to fight these thoughts, but to see them for what they are: mental noise. With awareness, their power diminishes. In summary, inner resistance is the mind's struggle against reality, creating tension and suffering. Breaking free from resistance does not happen all at once. It is a practice. It starts with noticing when resistance arises. The moment one becomes aware of it, one creates space between oneself and the reaction. This space allows for choice. Instead of getting lost in mental arguments, one can step back and simply observe. With time, resistance weakens and presence grows stronger. Inner resistance feeds the ego, fuels negative emotions, and keeps people trapped in patterns of frustration. Tolle explains that resistance is unnecessary. It does not fill any useful function whatsoever, and it needs to be met with presence and a willingness to accept and let go. Acceptance does not mean passivity. It allows energy to flow into clear action instead of inner conflict. The choice is always between resisting life or allowing it. Life will continue to unfold, with its ups and downs. Challenges will come, and change will happen. but inner resistance does not have to be part of the experience. In resistance, there is struggle. In allowing, there is peace. The mind will always try to convince you that struggle is necessary, but in the end, it is nothing more than a habit that can be unlearned. Finally, if you've paid attention to what has been said in this video, you may have noticed that much more time has been spent on describing the quote-unquote normal, habitual state that we are operating from than on what we are moving into. A big reason for this is that this higher state can merely be touched upon through description and words, and another is that it really is very simple. In essence, you just step away from all of the activity, movement, triggers, noise, and so on that characterize our normal lives in the five-sense reality. It's a subtle shift away from doing and into being, from a forceful stimulus-response mindset where you are identified with the content of your experience, into conscious, powerful, detached action from a place of clarity and awareness. Our minds are in this context limited to understanding all of the things that this state is not, so that it can learn to recognize more and more when we are sleepwalking through life, just reacting the way we've always done while thinking that we are making conscious choices. What is hopeful is that, according to Tolle, once this shift has begun, there's no real going back, even if it might seem like it at times. It's just a question of how much we will resist, and thus how much pain we need to go through before we let go. This is different for everyone, and to a large degree dependent on how much emotional baggage we've accrued throughout our lifetime, even if total surrender is possible in every given moment. So savor the moments of stillness and clarity when the inner activity calms down. Learn to recognize when they happen. Notice how these moments over time become longer and more frequent, and how they more and more become your natural state, until you finally, one day, completely relax into the present moment. Let go, surrender, and allow life to happen through you. This last part is worth emphasizing. When you understand what it means that you can allow life to happen through you instead of trying to control life with your mind, you are well on your way along the path to freedom. You've now reached the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for your time.